To get you up to speed on XML, let's take a step back and take a look at data history and how XML came to us. First of all, back in the early days of computers, and this is back in the mainframe days, data was always in a proprietary format. It was unique to the manufacturer of the computer system that was running the data or using the data, and it was also unique to the platform. In the early days, the Microsoft Apple wars, data was unique between them, and these machines did not talk to each other. In my early years with one of the telecommunications firms in the Southeast, we went to Atlanta one year and saw this demonstration that absolutely just flipped us out. We couldn't believe we were looking at it. They actually had an IBM like an XT or an AT sitting there with a cable between them, and it was transferring data or sharing data with an Apple Macintosh, and we just couldn't believe we were actually seeing that happen. You know, we wonder what mad scientist had brought this about, because in those days, data was pretty much locked into the platform or the manufacturer that you were dealing with. HTML, now keep in mind, this data history is not necessarily chronological because a lot of these things were in an overlap and some happened before others and so forth. HTML, the hypertext markup language, came along, and it was a subset of SGML and so forth, but this at least provided standard markup. Now this came from the Defense Department and from the world of the universities and colleges and so forth, but everybody was looking for a way to just pass generic data that at least they could mark it up and see it between systems, regardless of who built them or why they built them or who was running them and so forth. They just wanted to get the data. And this early data was passed across just in Courier font, and it wasn't very fancy and so forth. So HTML gave us a standard markup. Now, it was browser-based, and this set off the browser wars between Microsoft, Netscape, and the other folks. But HTML gave us a way to run a browser on any platform and then open up an HTML document in that browser and share the data between the platforms. And this was very cool. However, some limitations became very apparent about HTML after just a short period of time. One of the things that really added to that limitation was the database explosion that took place in the 90s. A little company out there called Ashton Tate released a product called DBase. Also, Microsoft introduced Access, and there were quite a few databases out there. So if I didn't mention your favorite, forgive me. But a lot of these little databases weren't really relational in the truest sense of the word, but they gave us a real good introduction. Now, what happened was people realized, hey, wait a minute. In the internet world, I can collect a lot of data from people. And if I can store it in the database, then I can, then hand it back to them, or I can learn all kinds of information and so forth. And so the database explosion on top of HTML was really cool because now we could put information in databases, and we started to get a lot more sophisticated with our web pages and so forth. Then HTML really began to show its limitations because since it was just a markup language, once I delivered that data to the browser, I pretty much lost the meaning of the data. It was only identified by the markup terms that the browser used. Along came XML. Now, XML actually first was born as an idea back in November 1996. Now, if you go out to the W3C site, which I'll talk about later, you'll see, you can look up the history of XML. It got a slow start, slowly gained speed, and now it's kind of become the standard. Now, XML is a markup, the extensible markup language. It lets us mark up the data that the browser is going to show, but the data is still self-describing, and I'll explain this in an upcoming video where we talk about exactly what XML is. But understand that even though the data has been pulled from a database or served from a web server, the tags around it still describe it to us. It's self-describing, and this has further fulfilled the promise of HTML. This is standardized data. Now, in an XML world, I can send you data that you can open up and tell exactly what this data is and how this data should be formatted on the screen. What's even better, you can then query this data for your own subset of data from it. You can compare this data to other pieces of data, and you can determine, for example, how it should be marked up. Do you want to see it in a browser at a certain size, a certain color? Do you want to see it as a PDF document? What? It's pretty much limitless. So that's kind of how the data history has led us to XML. Now through most of the course, I'll compare XML to HTML, and that's why we have that prerequisite out there about HTML. The more you know about HTML, the easier it is to get your hands and your head around XML. So that's how we got XML. Now let's go take a look a little deeper into what XML is, how it looks, and how it behaves.